Hello everyone, welcome to our final seminar in our first year of this seminar, of the Centre Seminar Series. Thank you very much for joining us today on what is, in most of the country, an absolutely gorgeous summery day. And we're really pleased that you'd be here with us virtually for a fantastic discussion and presentation with Harriet Cooper. We're going to give everyone just a couple of minutes, maybe give another minute or two until about 3 past, something like that, just for the last few people to come in. I think we've got nearly everyone we're expecting. While I'm waiting for the last few people to come in, just to give a little bit of housekeeping kind of stuff. So the structure for today is slightly different from some of our other seminars. First of all, Harriet's going to give a paper. Then Harriet and I are going to have a kind of a sort of structured conversation for a bit, addressing some of the kind of points that come out of both her paper and also her monograph, Critical Disability Studies and the Disabled Child, Unsettling Distinctions. And then we will have a brief comfort break, which should be somewhere around about 2:45, 10 to 4, and then we'll come back for a more expansive Q&A and discussion. But throughout the paper and through the structured conversation that Harriet and I will be having, please do feel free to put questions, comments, whatever you'd like inside the chat. I'll be checking that in the break, and then also when chairing the Q&A. Please do please do use that. Also, we have captions as well, so please do make use of those as well if that would be of use to you. And normally I announce what we've got coming up as well, but we have one last thing coming up, which is on the 1st of July, the Symposium of National Syndromes, which is being led by Lara Choksi and Des Fitzgerald. I think that a link to that has just popped up in the chat from Mel, so thank you very much, Mel. That's brilliant. So please do check that out and book to come along. Lovely. I think I'm going to kick off. So first of all, let me introduce Harriet. Harriet is a lecturer in medical and health humanities at UEA. She did her first PhD, which is the basis of the monograph, at Birkbeck, and has just completed her second PhD at UEA in medical sociology, exploring disabled people's lived experiences of rehabilitation. It's a massive pleasure and honor to have Harriet here. Her monograph is fantastic, and everyone should go and read it. So do that immediately after this seminar finishes. So I'm going to hand over now to Harriet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really sweet of you and really lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me okay, everyone? Cool. I'm going to try and share my screen now for my presentation, which is a section of the book from chapter 3 of the book, in which I am discussing diagnosis and diagnostic speech. The book overall, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look online, but it's, I suppose it's, as a project, I began it thinking I was going to be looking at the cultural construction of the disabled child in contemporary literature and culture, or maybe kind of in children's literature even. And then as I got deeper into the project, I found that more and more, that I was wanting to trouble that more and more. And I was thinking about subject formation and the formation of disabled subjectivity, and I began to feel more and more that I was writing about myself and my own lived experience of growing up with a mild physical impairment, hemiplegia. And so in the end, then the book became kind of a range of different kind of discussions centering around this concept of making the disabled child, from a range of different theoretical viewpoints. So I'm just going to launch into this, I think. I think I'll be speaking for about 20 or 25 minutes. So how does diagnosis make for a traumatic re-evaluation of the future of a baby? Whereas the process of monitoring the quote-unquote normal child might be said to produce generalized, ongoing, ordinary anxiety, diagnosis is a shock. It takes place in one moment of time and arguably cuts through time, creating a before and an after, a past and a future. In this sense, diagnosis lives up to its etymology. The Greek word dia means through or asunder. Diagnosis brings knowledge that cuts through time, traumatically sundering the before from the after. There can be no return to the ordinary anxiety of the past once diagnosis has been spoken. So when my disability was diagnosed, it was accompanied by a prognosis that I might never learn to swim, might never ride a bike, and might never play a musical instrument. I wanted to explore what the effect of this speech act might be on the parents of an 11-month-old baby. A contradictory duality arises when the modal verb might, with its sense of possibility, is juxtaposed with the adverb never, which connotes negative certainty and closure. What is given with one hand is taken away with the other, but neither hand succeeds in giving or in taking. Hope is not completely dashed. A glimmer remains, taunting, tantalizing. The taunting duality of the might never focuses parents' attention on the future as a kind of glittering prize that's just out of reach. We might also note that the activities discussed in this prognosis, swimming, riding a bike, playing a musical instrument, immediately transport parents into a future temporal mode or a futural temporal mode. So J.L. Austin, the philosopher of language, distinguishes between the illocutionary and the perlocutionary speech act. With the former, the pronouncement itself makes something happen. The latter type is performative to the extent that certain deeds will follow as a result of it. The speech act of the consultant who diagnosed my impairment had both qualities. It was illocutionary in the sense that the doctor's words, quote unquote, made me disabled in the moment that they were spoken, of which more in the next section, and perlocutionary in that particular consequences followed from the words, a program of rehabilitation and an uncertain future. Whilst most parents probably do imagine their baby's future, a prognostic speech act such as this calls upon parents to imagine their baby's future in terms of specific, concrete activities. In Sarah Ahmed's terms, we might think of the prognostic speech act as one that orientates or turns parents towards the future in a very specific way. In being turned by diagnosis towards a specific kind of future, is it possible that a turning away from the baby may also be enacted? When doctors put specific childhood activities into the category of the might never, they invoke an actual future made up of concrete activities such as learning to swim, potentially casting such activities as goals. In the disorientation that the diagnosis creates about the future, perhaps the thought of enabling the child to learn to swim, for example, can provide a point of orientation for parents who might themselves be feeling lost at sea and as though they need to relearn to swim. The baby's future may thus be imagined in terms of specifics. Whereas for the quote unquote normal baby, the future is encountered. For the newly diagnosed baby, it has to be constructed for fear that it might not otherwise happen. The disruptive, disabled baby, who in Anna Mollo's terms might not even have a future at all, has to be rescued for futurist agendas. So drawing on Lee Edelman's work on reproductive futurism, Anna Mollo coins the term rehabilitative futurism to describe this process of rescuing the child for the future, essentially. A disabled child has to be rehabilitated through therapy programs and other measures to ensure that she too has a future. Rehabilitative futurism thus claims the child for a normative future. In acting as a reminder of mortality and fragility, the figure of the disabled child provokes a kind of manic reclamation on the part of the dominant order. This figure threatens the fabric of reproductive futurism in representing human fragility, and as a result has to be fiercely reincorporated into the dominant order through a rehabilitation program that will orientate her towards the future, not less than other children, but more than them. Okay, so for the remainder of the paper, I'm actually going to turn to Judith Butler's work, Excitable Speech, A Politics of the Performative, to think about the Diagnostic Speech Act as a kind of act of injurious speech. And that little intro, I think, in some ways might seem to kind of set things up in too much of a kind of binary between the disabled child and the quote unquote normal child. So I suppose I would want to just sort of add to what I've just said there, that the book kind of moves in and out of different kinds of registers, some of which are perhaps more militant and more angry, spoken from a kind of disabled child subjectivity, and some of which are more kind of, I suppose, theorizing. And I think one of the main things I'm trying to do in the book is to interrogate tensions and not to sit comfortably with one theory or one position. I'm kind of interested in positionality and in fact I suppose in really interrogating kind of the idea of position per se, because the book is a lot about physiotherapy, my own physiotherapy as a child, and the way in which that's a kind of literal impositioning of the child, like asking the child to take up a particular position with her feet as she walks across the physiotherapy studio. And so, yes, I suppose I wanted just to kind of say that when I mobilize these terms in kind of binary opposition, sometimes I'm kind of doing that to mobilize a sort of angry voice, but overall the book is interested in polyvocality and in kind of moving between different voices and in questioning the idea of taking up a position. Okay, so to turn to excitable speech, Butler emphasizes the ambivalence of the act of naming, exploring the different directions in which it moves. One is not simply fixed by the name that one is called, she notes, complicating Althusser's unidirectional model of interpellation, the process through which the subject is called into subjectivity. Her argument continues. Quote, in being called an injurious name, one is derogated and demeaned, but the name holds out another possibility as well. By being called a name, one is also paradoxically given a certain possibility for social existence, initiated into a temporal life of language that exceeds the prior purposes that animate that call. Thus, the injurious address may appear to fix or paralyze the one it hails, but it may also produce an unexpected and enabling response. If to be addressed is to be interpellated, then the offensive call runs the risk of inaugurating a subject into speech who comes to use language to counter the offensive call. So, if the diagnosis of my disability is understood as an injurious speech act, it is one that has nonetheless created a scene of agency from ambivalence and a set of effects that exceed the animating intentions of the call, according to Butler. The Diagnostic Speech Act that, quote, subordinated me is also one that enables me to speak of this experience. However, I want to probe this conceptualization of the Speech Act via what might be thought of as a speculative phenomenological investigation of the performative power of diagnostic speech on the body of the disabled child. And this is informed by the narrative that I've pieced together of my own unknowable lived experience of diagnosis. Can a parallel be drawn between the kind of speech under discussion in Butler's excitable speech, i.e. injurious speech, and the Diagnostic Speech Act. Diagnosis, as sociologists of this subject attest, can perform a range of functions, some of which are experienced as helpful or even emancipatory by the patient. By juxtaposing diagnostic speech and injurious speech, I'm seeking to defamiliarize a routine part of the medical encounter, and to ask that we look afresh at it, and to ask, what is it like? Especially, what is it like if one cannot understand it rationally in words? Diagnosis is a practice of naming, and thus an activity that evokes and reproduces a particular history. Quote, this is Butler again. The name has thus a historicity, what might be understood as the history which has become internal to a name, has come to constitute the contemporary meaning of a name, the sedimentation of its usages that have become part of the very name, a sedimentation, a repetition that congeals, that gives the name its force. In my own history, the naming of my impairment as cerebral palsy has stood out as something indigestible. Diagnosis here is a form of citation, to use Butler's term, in that the utterance cannot help but join with and be made meaningful by a field of previous utterances. The term cerebral palsy is given force by its prior instances, by its historicity, and in this sense it performs something when it's used for the first time to describe another individual. So I now want to probe a little further into Butler's characterization of the act of naming, which he claims does not, just to go back to this quotation, doesn't fix or paralyze a subject in spite of appearances. So this fascinates me, obviously, from a critical disability studies perspective, this language choice. So how can we be sure that a speech act does not fix or paralyze a subject? From where do we obtain the capacity to use terms against their originary purposes? What if the speech act is delivered in a moment prior to the subject coming into language? What if it is indeed her inauguration into language, but that in constituting her, it also unmakes her? What if the founding speech act, the speech act that interpolated me as a subject, was also one which interrupted my being? What if the pre-verbal child can make neither head nor tail of the inaugurating speech act, which only makes itself known through belatedness and through repetitive phenomena? To quote Kathy Carruth, I'm especially interested in Butler's choice of the term paralyze, given its connotations of impairment. In choosing such a term, but in suggesting that it is not in fact sufficient to encompass the effects of the injurious speech act, Butler frames language as a tool that enables as much as it disables, and which moreover mobilizes rather than immobilizing the subject. Yet, by the logic of Butler's own argument, the very deployment of the terms fix and paralyze, which cannot fail but to conjure the disabled body, also fail to dispel the disabled body from the mind of the reader, purely by being conjured in the negative. This image stays there. Indeed, the body and physicality are very much present in excitable speech, in spite of the fact that it is often regarded as a text about performativity as a property of discourse. Drawing on Shoshana Fellman's work, Butler pauses in the first chapter on the incongruous relationship between the body and its speech. Here the body comes to stand for, quote, unknowingness, precisely because its actions are never fully consciously directed or volitional. Somehow, this image reminds me of cerebral palsy, of the body that jerks and wobbles in its never fully consciously directed or volitional being. This body for which there is a disconnect between the neural messages and the muscular activity, which was so much part of the kind of childhood messaging I received about what my disability was. So metaphors of immobility, circulation, life and death persist throughout excitable speech, almost as if the speech under discussion is a homeostatic organism. And this is purely illustrative, this slide, of a kind of homeostatic organism, regulating itself so that every movement in one direction is matched by a symmetrical one in the other direction. A threat of death is also an incitement to life. The wounding effects of hate speech cannot be simply immobilized via censorship, pedagogy, or legal proceedings, because such proceedings require that the language be revived and reiterated. And for Butler, there's no way to invoke examples of racist speech, for instance, in the classroom without invoking the sensibility of racism, the trauma, and for some, according to Butler, this is Butler's quotation, the excitement of racism, that is. So the very idea of citation has a kind of danger to it. It's always evoking something that we might not want to evoke. We might be reminded of the language of the circle and of reciprocity invoked by Derrida in his work on economy and given time. That's a text that I discuss in some depth in this chapter, and obviously that's not kind of so much part of this paper, but I'm interested in economies across the book and in this chapter in particular. And so Butler's idea of the circuit here is clearly relevant. And yet the images of circuits and of movement are not permitted to proliferate endlessly in Butler's text. They encounter blockages. For example, they seem to come to a stop in and through the name. Quote, "The name carries within itself the movement of a history that it arrests." Here, Butler overtly references Foucault's discussion of power as an arresting force, as well as one that derives its force from movement. But it is surely also significant that this discussion takes place within the context of a section on Althusser's policeman who interpolates the subtext. Furthermore, as we've seen, the name is associated with sedimentation, a term with connotations of laying down of the static, the pronouncing of the infant as well attached or shy, or in my case, handicapped, that was a word that was used a lot in the 80s, fixes that child's commodity value. Named as the unasked for gift, the disabled child is rhetorically positioned as beyond the reach of linguistic and monetary economies, as if this would exempt her stock from commodification, and yet this proves impossible. Again, that's a reference to other work within the chapter. To be associated with the gift is to be weighed down in another way. It is to be simultaneously liberated from economy's movement whilst being painfully inside of it and aware of it. So although I hesitate to make a case for where emphasis lies in excitable speech, I cautiously suggest that tropes of mobility and agility are inflected with optimism, while tropes of stasis are associated with a model of subject formation, Althusser's, that is seen as problematically unidirectional. And paradoxically, stasis is shown always to give way to mobility again. It is impermanent. Stasis is homeostasis. It might seem like stasis, but movement is taking place to maintain this stillness. So where does this leave us in terms of disability politics? Whilst I find Butler's argument about the, quote, redeployment of the word that wounds in the service of resistance highly persuasive, does it work for thinking through the experience of being diagnosed with a disability in early childhood? So for the next part of the chapter, I move into a more phenomenological mode, and I'm just going to very briefly outline the beginnings of the form that takes before I conclude. So I want to move into a more phenomenological mode as I think through the implications of this model, Butler's model, with the pre-linguistic child's diagnostic scene in mind. Butler speaks briefly about what it might mean to be named without knowing that one is named, which, she notes, is the condition of all of us at the beginning, unquote. As she observes, one need not know about or register a way of being constituted for that constitution to work in an efficacious way. Yet, what if one does not know consciously that one is named, but one nevertheless knows this pre-consciously, affectively? I want to suggest that the injurious diagnostic speech act that is delivered upon the pre-verbal child can indeed paralyze that emergent subject. Its effects play themselves out across and through the body in wordless affect. I do not think this hypothesis is necessarily at odds with Butler's argument in Excitable Speech, which recognizes the capacity of the name to operate via an encoded memory or a trauma. She notes, the force of the name depends not only on iterability, but on a form of repetition that is linked to trauma, on what is, strictly speaking, not remembered, but relived, and relived in and through the linguistic substitution for the traumatic event. So here it is the connection between trauma and the belatedness of language, or its incongruity, that intensifies the power of the name. It could be argued that the infant is in some ways more susceptible to injury by language than the verbal subject, or at any rate, susceptible in a different way. As the interdisciplinary theorist Teresa Brennan notes, there is a physical aspect to words, to the quavering notes of language, and it is the physicality of language which affects the preconscious baby. Julia Kristeva's term, the semiotic, can also be invoked here to conceptualize the baby's experience of language. The semiotic is the psychosomatic modality of the signifying process. It refers to the sensual rather than the symbolic properties of language. If freedom from the affects means freedom for the feelings to be known to consciousness, then the baby who lacks the apparatus for making something known to consciousness also lacks the capacity to free herself from the affects of the speech acts that take place around her. Brennan notes that through processes such as psychoanalysis, quote, language releases us from the affects via words that express something occluded. So words, in a sense, release some kind of trapped energy for Brennan. To the baby, however, the speech act is only affect. The baby may come to harbour in her body the very energy to which Brennan refers. Is there a contradiction here in that I'm suggesting that the child is at once the site of projected affective energy and is also potentially paralysed, in Butler's terms, by the diagnostic speech act? In this case, I argue the paralysis and the energy coexist. The paralysis is a state of trapped energy. This energy cannot be released in words in a speech act that would, quote, counter the offensive call. This energy may then be employed unconsciously by the subject to enforce the paralysing effects of the injurious speech act in an act of introjection of the aggressor, to use the terms of Sandor Ferenczi, the psychoanalyst. So I'm concluding now, but essentially, I suppose just to paraphrase what I'm doing in the rest of the chapter, I'm arguing here that the baby comes somehow to identify with injurious speech. And I'm arguing contra Butler in some way that the pronouncement of disability on a subject that cannot counter that offensive call, if we want to call it that, doesn't necessarily lead to a kind of fluidity and agility to remake the name, and instead kind of becomes internalized and has a certain sort of toxic quality. And I go on to develop this analysis of injurious speech via an engagement with the work of Frantz Fanon and Sandor Ferenczi in the remainder of the chapter. So yeah, I think maybe this paper is a sort of paper that's kind of gone between various different modes of my work, and I would want to emphasize the way in which sometimes I'm using this constative mode of making an argument, if only then just to want to question that in a subsequent paragraph. In fact, I'd be quite interested. I don't know, Michael, I think we maybe should go over to the discussion now, and I'll stop sharing, but I guess I would be quite interested in knowing what was your experience of that in reading the text, how it came across. And I, I'm not sure, just sometimes when I've looked back at the book, I've sort of felt as though the sentences are a bit long and winding, and I wonder what point I'm really making.
So I definitely didn't find your sentences long or winding or lacking in point. I think that first of all, thank you for that fantastic paper, and I hope you can do a little round of the little yellow claps that we've become so familiar with seeing. And 18 months ago, we would have no idea what I was talking about if I said little yellow claps. We were talking about that about this, I guess, this diagnostic moment as this, and the part of the book where one of the parts of the book where you describe it, I think in relation, and apologies if I'm misremembering this, in relation to the overlooking and overlooking distinction. But you describe yourself as an 11-month-old child who's suddenly kind of unmade in some way in this moment, and also that there was a thing or a feeling or a way of being in the world which had not yet come to consciousness for you, that had not yet come to be really, and was already then being pathologized and was already then being kind of undone before it was even done. And I think that kind of reverberation of the violence of the moment, it makes me, I wanted to think with it, if it's possible for a minute, in relation to something that I use in my work of Deleuze's event as a kind of, and you use the word cut yourself, but the sharp kind of cut, and then the cut is the thing which structures, in a way that everything, that the event kind of structures even what's gone before, and it was building to the cut. So I wonder if that, I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that diagnostic violent kind of cut that takes place.
That's really interesting. I'm not particularly much a Deleuze-Guattarian person, but yeah, I think temporality is really important in the work, and I'm really interested in how this diagnostic scene does structure the future. I guess I don't think so much about how it then maybe works retroactively to kind of refigure the past, the baby's past, but then I suppose maybe just to tell a little anecdote that kind of perhaps does feed into this temporality thing. My impairment was diagnosed when I was 11 months old, but it's quite mild. So my parents didn't kind of notice it to begin with. It was kind of invisible. And my grandmother, who was medically trained, was saying to my mum, kind of during the first year of my life, oh, Harriet doesn't really look out of the left side of her cot. She was really observant, I guess. She was like, Harriet seems to kind of look to the right. And then eventually she was saying, oh, does Harriet use her left hand as much as her right? And so when I was 6 months old, my parents took me to the consultant then and said, is everything okay with this child? And they looked at me and they said, yeah, she's fine. So I had this kind of moment at 6 months old where I was sort of pronounced fine. And then I suppose the kind of logic of impairment started to inscribe itself upon my body, because that's how cerebral palsy is, I think. I was actually recently just reading a pamphlet called The Hemiplegic Child, that's a kind of little guide for parents. It's published by the Spastic Society, now Scope, in the 60s and then revised in the 80s. I was looking at a 1988 version, which would have been, from when I was about 8, I suppose. And it is very much, you might find that to begin with, you can't really see much of what your child's impairment is like, but it's very important that you keep practicing the exercises in order to prevent deformity. It actually uses that word, deformity. And so I suppose I kind of try to think in the book about the body having its own kind of hemiplegic logic, perhaps, that is being inscribed gradually, and then the diagnostic speech act kind of interrupting that in a sense. But I think it's kind of fascinating had this kind of failed diagnosis as well. And I try to theorize in chapter 1 how that then leads to, I try to think about this in terms of interpretive practices and reading practices, and also the medical gaze, and then the kind of internalization of a medical gaze, so that then I try to think, yes, as you say, I coin this term overlooking, and overlooking with its dual sense of kind of missing something and scrutinizing something too much. And then I apply that to my own sort of obsessive compulsive anxiety structure, which is also something I'm trying to analyze in the book. And I'm interested in the kind of dualism, or the doubting gaze, the way that kind of moment of being told, no, she's fine, can kind of enact itself in the way that I kind of go about my life. And so I try to think about that as a kind of OCD structure, in the sense that I'm looking at the gas taps and they're all off, and I'm going, no, it's fine, they're all off. But something in me is going, no, it's not quite right, it's not quite right. I have to keep looking, I have to keep diagnosing, almost. Sorry,
yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Not sure.
I was just that. I mean, I mean, that's so fascinating and really powerful. And I think that idea that there was it, the kind of the diagnostic. And I hope it's okay that I'm using the word. You do use the word violence sometimes, but not continually in relation to this. But the kind of violence and the kind of power grab that diagnostic moment enacts not only echoes forward, but also goes back to reclaims that moment of you being 6 months old, of like, this child is fine, and however, whatever that might mean.
Yeah.
It reclaims that as a sort of, no, actually that was a mistaken counter reality, which we've actually now we've rewritten that, and then that maps so fascinatingly onto the OCD sort of need to look, because as if there is that moment when actually the gas is open and the house blows up, and this mustn't be the moment when you looked at the tap and thought it was fine and it wasn't.
Yeah,
like the cut is there, the event is there in the future, and you must admit it now.
Exactly. I think it's like that thing. Drawing at quite a lot, I suppose, on Freud's idea of what we kind of look for in the future is actually a memory of the past, and exactly that kind of sense of danger in the surrounding world is sort of projected into it, because this sense of something might have been missed, this sense that the scrutinizing gaze and the kind of what's the word I'm looking for, hypervigilance. The kind of hypervigilance is a kind of necessary state somehow, because that kind of diagnostic moment got rewritten. Yeah,
I think it's that tyranny as well of that moment, and when you were talking about might never, this would be the echo. I apologize for the slightly kind of frivolous reference, but when I was reading the book, it was echoing in my head. So like, might never come. What is that? And then when you're saying it, then I just remembered it's Don Vito Corleone to the baker at the start of The Godfather, where he does the favor for him. And he says, one day, and that day might never come, I may ask you for a favor. And then you realize that person is entirely, he's bought now, he's owned. Like whatever potential future that person's life has, Don Vito Corleone has an ownership over it, and might never covers every potentiality. And that diagnostic moment seems to do the same thing. Say, well, it might never. I own all this terrain that's opening up here. Imaginatively, all the possible futures and the pasts are owned by this tyrannical power. I'm much more negative about the diagnostic moment than you are, I think, because I realize I'm using tyranny and power and violence, and you're much more even-handed, I think, in your account of it than I'm being.
I'm not sure, but yeah.
I wanted to I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit, because there's many fantastic sections in the book, but the section when you are giving a kind of Marxist critique of child developmentalism, and talk about this as a sort of multi-layered mode of inducting the child as a kind of good, and interpolating the child as a good capitalist subject. I'm wondering if, like, you could talk to that for a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I'm just gonna find a relevant page. I guess that work kind of grew out of an interest in this kind of figure of the normal child, and then coming to realize that that was that, or wanting to kind of do a kind of Foucauldian archaeology of that term, or maybe genealogy of kind of not the normal and the developmental, to think about where they come from, and how we come to have them in that form now. And yeah, so I suppose there is a sort of uncomfortable, or not always happy, kind of moving between kind of Marxist approaches and Foucauldian approaches in that chapter. But yeah, I guess what should I talk about? I'm just trying to think what might be best. I suppose maybe I would want to talk about Jasbir Puar's work briefly, or
Sorry, I just missed just what you said there.
I might just briefly talk about how I use Jasbir Puar's work.
Yes, yeah, perfect, yeah.
Because I think Jasbir Puar, I heard she's just an amazing academic, who I heard speak maybe in the last year of my PhD, when it was kind of a bit too late, and it was that terrible thing of like, oh gosh, now I sort of have to rewrite how I think about everything, because it was one of those talks that transforms the way you think. And I suppose her concept of debility became really central to my thinking, and has continued to be, I think, even though in a way it doesn't feature center stage in the book. But I guess I might just very briefly read a little bit from the top of page 62, where I'm talking about a kind of alignment between economic notions of development, or the developing world, or the developed world, and then kind of the developed body, while the techniques for measuring economic development construct a hierarchy of nations. The technologies of developmental psychology permit a hierarchical organization of bodies. The disabled child, whose body registers at the low end of this hierarchy, is thus also marked by the imperialist tendencies of developmentalist thinking. Yet, to frame this point, drawing on Jasbir Puar's work, bodies that are understood as disabled rather than crippled are ones that have already been retrieved for subjectivization via the human rights discourses that circulate within Anglo-American disability studies. Quote, part of what gels the disabled body is that it is hailed by rights discourses, writes Puar. Part of what gels the disabled body that is hailed by rights discourses is the availability of the process of rehabilitation. Thus, the bodies of children that are seen as worthy of rehabilitation already exist within a paradigm in which disability is seen as the exception, and disability is something which must be mitigated in order to retrieve an empowered disabled subject. So I think this is really interesting, this idea of rights discourses gelling a disabled body, or bringing a disabled body into being, and that rehabilitation itself and its availability and access to rehabilitation is something that then gives us disability as an object of discourse, as an object of understanding. And she introduces the term debility, and kind of wants to think about debility and capacity alongside disability, in order to think about the ways in which certain populations are sort of wholly debilitated, but don't sort of even get come into the spectrum of being seen within rights discourses. And obviously she draws a lot on Palestine as her example, and in terms of thinking about the way in which the disabled subject of critical disability studies of North American and British disability studies is the exception, I suppose, is somebody who's seen as the exception, rather than that everybody is somehow debilitated by a colonial or neo-colonial regime. So yeah.
Yeah, and I really like. I really want to kind of draw out that a slightly different section. I think you look at the rehabilitative work that you were doing in your physiotherapy sessions, and you were contrasting, not contrasting, you were comparing that to the play that the child does, and saying, well, actually, we're both doing types of work, and types of work which are predicated on capitalist logics of like, here's this investment in myself as a unitary, free liberal subject, and then the kind of benefits are going to accrue when I've acquired the social skills through play, or when I've adopted this, as you call it in later section, that this false body that's kind of socially amenable and exchangeable, and for the comfort of others as well. And I thought that was just a sort of really, that was a really kind of eye-opening snap moment of like, yeah, that is what's taking place. So you've really interesting, you kind of create that contrast, and then you say, no, these are parallel modes of work, and that the distinction then becomes, well, when does the child work? What's unacceptable for certain kind of liberal value systems is the child working for money, not the idea of the child. The child's body labors, and that's good, and we want that, and we're inducting them into the world of laboring, but not being remunerated. Capital likes to teach us to not be remunerated, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a great book called Pricing the Priceless Child, I think, and it was from that I got these fascinating insights, because obviously in this country in former times, paid child labor was a thing, and it's only kind of relatively recently that we think of the body of the child as somehow outside of kind of circuits of capitalist economy in a certain way, and we find it really degrading to think about the idea of paying a child for work. But I try to kind of draw on Silvia Federici's work in that section to kind of draw a parallel between that idea of why we can't think about children's labor as kind of transactional, and then kind of other the ways in which household labor is also, it has to be seen as a kind of labor of love and so on under capitalism, and Federici's critique of that. Yeah.
My next question is about time, but I'm also very conscious of the time, which is a very cheesy segue there, I realise. I'm thinking that we should probably take a 5-minute comfort break, because it is now nearly 10 to 4. So if we say we'll take a 5-minute comfort break until 5 to 4 for people, I'd love to be able to put a couple more of these questions to you, but I also don't want to abuse my my privileged position here as the chair. So I'll also look over what's in the chat and start to open that conversation up. But thank you so much. That was a fantastic paper. And, and everyone back in 5 minutes, please.
Great, thanks. See you shortly.
Okay, I think it's 5:02 now. Lovely. Hello. I wanted to be cheeky and keep just use my privilege here for just one more question, I think, which what I'll do is I'll combine two of the questions I wanted to ask and then open up. But you talk about the wobbliness of, well, you start talking about the wobbliness of the body, and then extend that to an idea of the wobbliness of the mind, and talk about using an epistemology of doubt as a critical method, which you counterbalance with what Ballant describes as the apostolic function of the doctor. And I think we've kind of detailed that function as we were talking about the kind of power of the diagnostic moment. But I'd love to hear a little more about the epistemology of doubt, and I'd like to also connect that to the really remarkable transdisciplinary approach that you adopt in the writing of the monograph, and one of the many remarkable characteristic strengths of it, where you combine very powerfully, both intellectually and effectively, your creative writing and autoethnography, with your analysis, and you kind of create what feels like a sort of anti-authoritative body of knowledge, as a sort of anti-authoritarian move, as I read it, a kind of like a form of knowledge that challenges authorized hierarchies of knowledge. So I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more about both those things.
Yeah. So I guess in a way this kind of grows out of something that I was alluding to briefly in the talk, which is that I did spend quite a lot of time thinking literally about the rehabilitative scene, which in my case was these physiotherapy sessions where I was constantly being told to put my heel down, like my left heel, and to walk with my heel down. So I was being invited always to become really conscious of something that for most people is probably just something that you allow the body to do automatically. And I became very interested in the phenomenology of that, I suppose, and of the way in which I've been constantly being asked to embody something that wasn't my body really, and being told, walk with your heel down. But actually, I was never going to quite achieve that completely. I think there was a kind of fantasy somewhere for me as a child, or within my family setting, within the kind of medical environment, that if I just kept on trying to do these exercises, then I would be cured, or my body would no longer have this impairment. And nowhere a real kind of acknowledgement or a space for grief that actually it wouldn't, it just was the body that I had. And so yeah, I guess out of that I became interested in a way in which I had, in a sense, been made to doubt my kind of my own body in space, like whether it moved in the right way, whether it was okay as it was, and that doubting, I came to realize in the process of writing the book, was something that was very, very sort of part of my psyche. But then I also, as you were saying, I became interested in the way that within medical hierarchy, doctors are constantly being trained not to doubt, and that it seems very important to the psychological function of a doctor to not to doubt or to sideline doubt. And I have a bit, so the memoirist Atul Gawande, in his book, his surgical memoir Complications, he tells us that there's a saying about surgeons which goes, "Sometimes wrong, never in doubt." This saying offers insight into the necessity of disavowing doubt in the service of acting quickly and making decisions that will hopefully save lives. So I came to think about medical authority and my own doubting sense of self as being kind of affects in play in this rehabilitative room, and this kind of wanting to kind of move between doubting and knowing became then part of what I also wanted to do in the book, and became, I think, part of my epistemology in a certain sense. I've just been listening actually to Lisa Baretza giving a wonderful, just been sort of listening back to her talk that she gave, I think last week, to the psychoanalytic summer school at Essex, where she was talking about method really. And she was talking about the idea that I thought it was just very beautiful. She talked about method as being something that you find for yourself, and that it in a way it isn't, or it shouldn't be, a kind of straitjacket framework. I think, yeah, I think I very much wanted to question hierarchies of method within academia and within certain disciplines. But it's not always very straightforward to do that, because then one's always being interpolated by ideas of authority and expertise, and kind of narcissistically wanting to occupy that space as well. So I think, in a way, yeah, there was something dialogic about my process, which was moving between authority and doubt all the time, and maybe that's kind of reflected in the way that I think. And I wanted to kind of retain that as a sort of polyvocality in the book. I didn't want it to be written over or written out, because I felt that it was a very important part of how the book had come to be. Yeah, so I think, sorry, that's a bit of a winding answer.
No, it's a perfect answer, and it really, because and that passage when you're talking about the kind of split that takes place, I guess when you're describing about how you're being indoctrinated into kind of putting your heel down as you're walking, and you describe this kind of, there's this false body that doesn't feel natural and doesn't feel like yours in some way, and that's being written over on you, and then also that denaturalizes and kind of makes false also the way that did feel comfortable as well. So you're kind of stuck with two kind of false bodies, yet when they're in dialogue with each other, they open up a truth about your experience. And it felt to me that the different voices in the text did the same thing, that with there's the kind of the authoritative imperatives when doing a PhD, when putting together a monograph, like, here's what has to be here, and here's how knowledge has to be used and built, and by having those passages, which were your kind of personal testimony, your creative writing, you're also kind of, it felt that you were making the other sections more truthful as well. You were kind of like bringing, it was only in that interplay between them that the real kind of the truth of your specific method and the truth of your specific argument kind of arose. I've really dominated this conversation now, and I'm going to bring Jamie in. I don't know, Jamie, if you want to take off, put on your camera and your mic and ask a question directly, or I can read out this quote, whichever your question rather, whichever you'd like.
Hello. Yeah, because I might risk dominating as well, because that was sort of, the comment was like an aside, and I also have other questions, so I think I might choose other questions if that's okay. I love this, Harriet. This was an amazing talk. I'm feeling, yeah, really enthusiastic about ideas that spiraled off in me. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about your kind of reading of Judith Butler, and how, I suppose, how you kind of are understanding these sorts of these problems of the language that she uses. As is it sort of like, is it a problem of Butler's theoretical framework, or is it also something embedded into the problem of what language is in the first place? Because I mean, I've kind of run up against quite similar concerns about sort of the impossibility of not thinking metaphors of movement in various texts, and it kind of makes me wonder, is this some sort of epistemological language of epistemological violence of language itself, or is it sort of like something that can be like worked against? And then just sort of the way you brought in this idea of kind of homeostatic regularity and things like that, I wondered if you could maybe talk a bit more about that, if that is the start of, yeah. So my questions always beat around.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I don't know, I kind of want to throw it back to you and ask you what you think, because I feel like that's a reading that I do, but I haven't thought extensively about that question in relation to other texts, I don't think. although I'm just starting to think about some new work on posture and comportment, and how they relate to expertise. And yeah, this is a little bit perhaps taking it off at a tangent, but I'm kind of interested in, well, I'm interested in various things relating to posture and how it kind of relates to politics. I've been thinking for a long time. I've been thinking, how does the comportment, the bodily comportment of a politician make us kind of trust them, or make us think that there's something phony about them? And then also wanting to think about posture in relation to disability, and also in relation to expertise, and thinking about how the kind of maybe certain norms within academia about how one comports oneself in order to generate a notion of expertise, or to generate a kind of posture of expertise. And then thinking about kind of Twitter and posturing. And so I guess I haven't really thought about the movement stuff in relation to Butler. I kind of I just wonder what you think, really.
I mean, like, I guess I sort of, I mean, I was just so, kind of aware of your, you're making these moves of positionality and dispositionality and impositionality. But I suppose I was sort of very intrigued by where you sort of seem to be taking it in the talk towards sort of like, actually this is a problem that seems to bring us towards these questions of like the physicality of language, and like language as like a thing that doesn't, like, that kind of has a set of properties that are not easily defined, but sort of sort of like the linguistic, it's almost a scientific object that might carry these sorts of ideological traces within it, and how that kind of affects, I suppose, like, the critical disposition of like reading a text as something that isn't pinned downable as a thing. So that's sort of no,
I definitely think so. And I also think, the fact that Excitable Speech was written in 1997, probably, and Butler has moved towards disability studies in recent years, I think. There's brilliant discussion that she does with Sunawa Taylor as part of the Examined Life film that Asta Taylor.
Yes.
I don't know if you know that, but
yeah.
I have a feeling that maybe if she was writing that text now, she would probably think twice about that particular language. I don't know. I'm not really sure if I have a kind of good answer, but it's a really good question.
I mean, that is a good answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. There's a question from Laura Salisbury now. I don't know if, Laura, you want to. Lovely.
Hi, thanks, Harriet. That was wonderful. I was just going to make a comment actually about what you were saying about Butler maybe writing things differently now, and certainly I think I know myself, I have written things in the past that now I think, gosh, that is not a metaphor I would use.
Yeah.
Good to be, it's good to have our kind of occlusions challenged in various ways. But anyway, I had a question about phenomenology, and about the ways in which, phenomenology, which has been such a kind of important force in medical humanities, so frequently seems to come via that moment in Merleau-Ponty, where some kind of impairment is represented as a kind of falling away from a state of health, or the norm, a kind of uprightness, I suppose. He talks about, our intentional threads going slack in illness, and just thinking about how so many of the kind of dominant ways in that the medical humanities has developed has often seemed to be concerned with an idea of sort of moving into disability or moving into illness, and how the disabled child seems to really interfere with that move. Because, and I was struck by what you were saying about the idea of being asked to form one's body into a shape that one's body struggles to match, or just simply doesn't match the way one's body wants to move. And I was just wondering if you could take us through a bit how you think that might push medical humanities on a bit to kind of challenge, perhaps do some different kind of work to what's come from that more kind of phenomenological tradition so far.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating question. When you say move into disability, you mean the kind of sense that it makes me it makes me think of Susan Sontag's her conceptualization of health and illness in illness as metaphor, and that kind of the two worlds or the two states. I'm just trying to recall it now. Do you mean it in the sense of illness as sort of temporary in some way, or something that one comes into at a later point in life? Or
yeah, or as, yes, as something that, you know, I mean, frequently, of course, you know, the sort of framing of, you know, the tragic accident or the that produces disability, and, you know, the way in which that trope gets, not particularly in medical humanities, but in general, that trope gets taken up as a particular kind of permissible. I
think that is exactly. I think it. Yeah, no, I think the disability studies has so much to offer. In fact, the text that really comes to mind right now is Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, because I find that that was, I did read Merleau-Ponty, the Phenomenology of Perception, but it was kind of queer phenomenology that really blew my mind when I was a PhD student. And that I think it's that idea that she has at the beginning of, I think she talks about, is it Husserl at his writing table, or which of the phenomenologists is it who's at the writing table?
I think it's Husserl.
Husserl, yeah, and how she talks about what needs to happen in order for Husserl to be able to be sat at that table producing writing, and what are the conditions of possibility that enable him to kind of do this thinking work about the table and the existence of the table. And then she sort of turns it on its head, really, and thinks about all the forms of labor that are invisible, that produce this sort of auto-affective male subject of philosophy. Yeah, so I guess something of that is, I think, really important when it comes to thinking about phenomenology. But also, yeah, I think that the figure of the disabled child really disrupts, or has the potential to disrupt, a kind of normative developmentalism within, oh yes, Husserl ignoring his children. I've just seen Jamie's comment. Yeah, I think, yeah, the idea that the body's hemiplegic logic is sort of there unfolding according to what it wants to do, but it then is interrupted by developmental norms. It does, maybe it decenters something, it changes the perspective. And I guess also another person who comes to mind right now is Felicity Callard, and her thinking around long COVID and the temporalities of illness, and the idea that illness is something that we imagine that we'll get better from, but and how the whole world is structured around that idea that we will get better and we'll go back to work. But what if that's not going to happen? And I think, yeah, I guess all of these things are in the mix. I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
Really helpful. I just think the intervention that you're making is really important for medical humanities as a whole. So thank you.
Oh, thanks, Laura. Thanks for coming.
So are there any other questions? I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat yet, but if someone has a question, just put something in the chat, or just take yourself off. I realize there should be a word, there should be a visual equivalent for mute, shouldn't there? Take yourself off camera. make yourself seen. Are there any questions? Because I've got plenty of questions that I still want to ask. So I'm going to use this little pause to sneak another one of my questions in then. And I guess this follows on from Laura's question to an extent. But and we were talking about this just before you gave your paper. But you in the conclusion you point towards some of the potential, the kind of radical potential of psychoanalysis, which so you make a claim there that's not common, and I'd love you to talk a little about that and about how you reconcile the practice, or you make gestures towards possible reconciliations and further kind of productive discussions between this radical psychoanalysis and critical disability studies. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little more.
Yeah. So as I was saying to you, Michael, before we kind of joined the actual session, that was that kind of work at the end where I tried to bring critical disability studies into conversation with psychoanalysis was something that was kind of on my mind throughout my work on this project, was kind of how can I be invested in psychoanalysis and critical disability studies when critical disability studies has been so, I think rightly in many ways, wanting to have nothing to do with psychoanalysis, and sees psychoanalysis as coming out of itself quite a medicalizing, pathologizing approach to thinking about embodiment and mental health and so on. And I was thinking, this is really difficult that I'm also kind of personally and academically invested in psychoanalysis, and maybe I was making it into more of a big deal than it actually was, but in my head it felt like, you know, I need to kind of work this argument out, what's happening here. And I suppose I guess I just, in the same way that throughout the book I've not exactly wanted to come down on the side of one position, in the sense that I think maybe position itself is something that I problematize as the thing that the physiotherapist sort of puts me into. I kind of wanted to see if it was possible to have this kind of this uncomfortable, discomforting investment in psychoanalysis that would constantly sort of disrupt me, I suppose. Or maybe I'll just read a little tiny bit to sort of explain what I tried to do. So I took a quotation from Nicholas Rose. Nicholas Rose's Governing the Soul, when he talks about psychological therapies and how he associates those with liberalism and with the anti-psychiatry movement with radicalism. He writes that psychological therapies promise not liberation from social constraints, but rendering psychological constraints on autonomy conscious, and hence amenable to rational transformation. Achieving freedom becomes a matter not of slogans nor of political revolution, but of slow, painstaking and detailed work on our own subjective and personal realities, guided by an expert knowledge of the psyche. And of course, in a certain sense, Rose is critiquing that. And I say that I do find Rose's argument very persuasive, and that he's not alone in connecting psychoanalysis with liberal thought. I find the argument especially difficult to refute, precisely because it engages the part of me that experiences psychoanalysis as physiotherapy, as a rehabilitative training and a means of control. Whilst I agree with Rose that, on the one hand, in the contemporary period, the cultural embedment of psychological thinking has brought about a paradigm shift whereby our truth is based on, quote, the relations between inner reality and external appearances. I believe that psychoanalysis, by addressing itself to the unconscious, can mobilize forces that are beyond its own knowing and hence beyond its own control. In my celebration of the symptom of anxiety resistance at the end of chapter 2, I suggested that in creating this symptom, in a certain sense, psychoanalysis had outdone itself, allowing something to be released that might work against the developmentalism invoked by the idea of getting better or cure. So in a sense, I'm arguing that psychoanalysis's radical potential is kind of in its ability to allow one to kind of re-experience suffering. It's a bit more complicated than that, but maybe, I don't know if other questions have cropped up and I should stop.
Is it in another section when you talk about it as a re-unmaking as well? Which
yeah, exactly. In the sense of that, in a way, I found the experience of psychoanalysis was one of repeating rehabilitation, and in that repetition of experiencing psychoanalysis as if it were physiotherapy, that was when so much became available for thought around cure and around what, yes, maybe I've got a sentence here. But what if its creator, the therapist, was not actually interested in curing it or curing the symptom, but only in understanding it on its own terms? My discovery prompted anger. How could the creator or the therapist walk away from the mess it had made so readily? In this moment, I understood that I was only able to value myself according to a paradigm of normalization, and that I believed that I could only be of interest insofar as somebody might want to fix me. So, sorry, maybe that's not really making any sense.
No, that's exactly what I meant. That's yeah. The bit that really that's the bit of this part of the argument that really fascinated me. The idea that it's, you know, that here is, it's about, it was a mechanism for you to be able to move away from those kind of controlling narratives of fix, of cure, of even kind of like that developmentalism, of a progress, of a kind of a logic of investment and return as well, which I think is really implicit in those ideas of the child and the child going through rehabilitation. And it also allowed you a really interesting temporal move. I mean, you know, maybe I have very kind of unfair and blinkered, unreconstructed Marxist critiques of psychoanalysis, of a kind of a sort of enslavement in the past. And for you, as the absolute reversal, it seemed, it kind of gave you, maybe not the absolute reversal, it didn't give you power over your past, rather it sort of, I've seen Laura's comment, it sort of gave you, it kind of undid that, what we were saying about that diagnostic cut, that meant that it, you know, where the diagnosis enabled it to reclaim even that which came before it. And the psychoanalysis allowed you to kind of undo that and rewrite it, and not wholly kind of claim it as your own, but to sort of free it from those fixities of possession. I think that's why it kind of, for me, also fitted so nicely with the different tones and voices of the text as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the conclusion, I do try to be sort of cautious about the way that what I want to reclaim when I reclaim psychoanalysis, because there are lots of, it does have very problematic history in relation to disability, but yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's something about a realization of precisely the way in which I had projected onto the process a desire to be fixed, a desire for cure, and that if I could then abandon that as the outcome, then that would somehow be making so much more available to thought for me about rehabilitation and what rehabilitation had meant in my life. Yeah, but it's a kind of paradoxical process of that re-experiencing being kind of a bit masochistic in a way, but also being freeing.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's we've only got a couple of minutes left. I don't know if anyone's got another question, because if not, if someone has, raise a hand or leap in. Otherwise, I was going to just invite you to you've already slightly referenced some about a direction your work's going in with this work on posture and the kind of presentation of the, I guess, the kind of presentation of bodies in the political. And we've also talked about your critical university studies work as well. So I'd love you just in these last couple of minutes just to sort of point to where you're going next, really, and talk a little about that.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm not sure really. It depends what I get funded to do, or yeah, who wants me to know. I should be more like purposeful about it. The other day I was saying to myself, oh, if I could just sort of, you know, announce in my head to myself, yes, I'm writing a book about comportment, and then that would sort of be performative in a certain sense, rather than relying on the idea that I need sort of external validation and of a funding body. It is, yeah, I think thinking about academia and the state that it's in is very much part of what I do at the moment. I'll be honest, and yeah, I suppose another project that I have alongside the comportment project is I'm interested in thinking about medical humanities itself as a discipline, in terms of thinking about how it has been or is becoming, or already is, institutionalized within the university in the UK, and thinking about particularly about the temporality of that in relation to the contemporary cultural moment in the humanities, and what it means, and what this institutionalization looks like according to different actors, and what it's for. I think the kind of what the medical humanities is for is a really fascinating question. So I've been trying to do that, conceptualize a project around that would have various research objects, one of which might be interviews with various different people, both academics and healthcare professionals perhaps, but also I've been trying to link that to a project looking at the health service memoir, or the medical memoir, which has really proliferated in about the last 3 or 4 years. There have been so many of them, and now of course there are also the COVID memoirs. And I suppose maybe the links are not necessarily that clear in how I'm thinking about the institutionalization of the medical humanities, but I think there is a sort of link in the sense of wanting to explore the NHS professional as someone who is sort of historically a kind of communal labourer, or a person who works for the common good, but who is also maybe in this moment of extreme crisis in the NHS drawn to need to kind of maybe move outside of that. If they're burnt out, they maybe turn to writing a memoir, and how then memoir writing becomes a form of self-commodification. And so that there's this kind of tension between writing to process something and writing to commodify oneself, which is also something that really fascinates me. Sorry, that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but
it's really exciting. I mean, from reading the monograph, there's just a really brilliant anti-authoritarian, subversive way that you have with your thinking that comes through in your writing, which I would love to see turned on the structures of power in the NHS, on the sort of institutionalization of medical humanities and of the neoliberal university. I think they are deserving of the same brilliant kind of and very sort of subtle kind of undoing from within that you've done with the kind of rehabilitative therapies, with the medical gaze, with the diagnostic speech and moment. I think they're ripe for your internal kind of unwinding of them and problematizing of them. So I massively look forward to that. It's now exactly 4:30, so I'm going to end the seminar, but just say thank you again, Harriet, for your brilliant book, for your brilliant paper, for the brilliant discussion. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. It was absolutely wonderful to have you here, and I can see all the little yellow hands popping up as well. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. It was really nice to be here, and thank you for inviting me, Michael. I really, really enjoyed it.
And thank you everyone for attending as well. Take care, stay safe, and hopefully soon we'll be doing these seminars in person as well. He says, casting no doubt like a hex on everything there, but hopefully not.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.